Welcome to this month's developer community call for Microsoft Graph. I'm Jeremy Thake, Principal Program Manager in Redmond here on the Microsoft Graph. And today we've got a really exciting session. These calls, if you're on them, obviously you've probably already hit this link, but if you'd like to share that with anyone else, it's just aka.ms, Microsoft Graph call, and that will get you added into ICS series in Outlook. So you can launch the Microsoft Teams call every month. They happen on the first Tuesday of every month. So the next one will actually be on October 1st, 2019, in a month's time. We have mainly Microsoft product managers and MVPs and regional directors on here sharing things about the Microsoft Graph. And it gives you the opportunity, if we have time at the end, to ask any questions, and feel free in the chat window in Teams as these presentations are happening to ask questions as well. Fortunately, I'll give you some more graph updates today and a bunch of things that we've been working on here in Redmond. And then we have two MVPs here presenting today. We have Paul Schaeflein and Vincent Biret talking about two different really awesome topics around SDKs and Azure Functions. And so if you aren't already following Paul and Vincent on Twitter, I would highly recommend adding them. They're always sharing great content around not just the Microsoft Graph, but M365 development and broader in general on a kind of a daily basis. In terms of updates, I'm going to switch straight over to a browser. If you aren't aware, we communicate with the Microsoft Graph through the developer.microsoft.com website. From the website, when you click on resources, you'll be able to see the blog. And inside of here, you'll see this month we've actually had some really, really nice updates. And so I wanted to start with the fact that if you aren't already in the Microsoft developer program, the Office 365 developer program, I'd highly encourage you to go sign up. If you go to graph.microsoft.com, which will result you in going to developer.microsoft.com, Graph, you see on the right-hand side of the top navigation is you can link straight from the program to this Office developer program. From here, you can actually go and sign up, and you get a bunch of benefits there as being part of that sign up. But one of the biggest benefits is the fact that you'll get a Office 365 tenant. And what we've just recently done internally is we've provided you an ability in the tenant you get signed up for to add sample packs. And to start with, we've added a user sample pack and a mail and event sample pack. This allows you to kind of deploy sample data into those environments in a really straightforward way. So that was one really cool bit of news around the developer program that came out this month. And in addition to that, America was on holiday yesterday, and so I'd only just seen this news this morning, is that the same team around the developer program, any net new developer program sign up now will have an E5 subscription rather than an E3 subscription. So there's a bunch of benefits that you'll get by being signed up for this program if you haven't already done so. And I know for those of you on the call that already have this developer program, in the blog post, and I've just reached out to the team, they are working on a way of migrating between E3 and E5 as part of the developer program tenant that you get. So again, please go sign up for that dev program if you haven't already. It's a great benefit when there's lots of different purposes that you can use that developer tenant to build, not just against the Microsoft Graph, but all sorts of other things in Microsoft 365. Now, in addition to that, this month, Daryl, who is my peer here and principal PM, who focuses on developer experience, but more specifically, he's kind of the SDK guy internally. We've just launched a new JavaScript SDK version. So, Daryl, do you want to give a quick update on where we're at with this?
Yeah, I certainly can. So there's not a lot of changes in here, but there were a number of breaking changes that we needed to make. So we bumped the version number up to 2.0. We'd had some feedback that some of the polyfills that we were bundling in were bulking up the SDK, and in some of the newer environments people are building, they just don't need those things merged in. So we removed the polyfill. So if you are using browsers that require those, you'll have to pull those polyfills in yourself now. And as part of that, we changed the files that can be shipped or that are available to bundle. So if you're using a script tag now, you just use graph-js-sdk.js. And we also have an ES6 lib if you are building libraries and you want to take a dependency on the SDK in your library. We made one other change, and this came from people who are doing development under Node, and they wanted to be able to get direct access to the raw response when making a request, rather than getting it converted into an object. They just wanted to get access to the response message. And previously, you had to use a callback, and there were some edge cases where it didn't work well in Node. So we deprecated that in favor of using just the standard response type. So in the same way that you say, oh, I'm going and getting a blob for a photo, you can now say response type.raw. And what will be returned back to you is just the individual response. The other big breaking change is around the authentication providers. And this was really just to adopt the released version of msal.js that introduced changes in the way that you create the public client, or the user agent application, as it's called in msal.js. We have adapted those changes, so now you can take a user agent application and pass it into the authentication provider, which previously you couldn't do. And we just did a little rename to be explicit about the fact that this is an implicit flow, OAuth flow, because hopefully we will soon have new flows available in our msal support, so that we can support things like client credentials in Node.js. We're just waiting on the msal team to ship that. And the last breaking change is that when you do a put method, previously we were not setting the content type to application JSON, and this caused some confusions for some people, so we've changed that behavior. And last but not least, we are now publishing our types on definitely typed. So if all you want are the TypeScript types, you can pull them directly from definitely typed instead of going and installing the complete SDK. And that's it for that release.
Awesome, thanks, mate. I appreciate that, and we'll try and keep that as a monthly thing, because these things are changing across the different languages. And if you haven't already seen any of the SDK work that we do, essentially whatever platform you're on, you can get started here, and you have the ability to jump in and either do a quick start that you can run within 2 minutes, get a zip file, extract it and run it locally in Visual Studio in .NET's case, or you can follow a tutorial, which takes typically 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how quick you are at reading and following the steps through. They both end up with the same project at the end, so depending on your learning style, and obviously you can jump straight into the SDK. And then we are actively working in the docs, if you haven't seen this already, in a use your SDK section. And so you can see here that we have some videos embedded, as well as the supported platform links and all the instructions you require in each language to kind of install those packages and get them working in your projects. Now, one last thing before we jump over to Paul, because I did say I'd be done at the 10-minute mark, is if you go over to API reference and go over to users, into users, and do get user. This is obviously the most common API that we have going for us at the moment. And if you're a listener of my podcast, you would have heard that we'd done this a few weeks ago in one of the shows that we talked about news. But one thing we've been working on inside of the example requests that we do in all the different API references is in our get requests now. We have built-in support for Graph Explorer. So when you click try now, you can click, and on the right-hand side now, Graph Explorer will launch, and you will see that you'll be able to see those responses in line in here with real-world data. And then you'll also have the ability to then, if you want to, kind of jump over to Graph Explorer and sign in with that full experience. But you'll find over time that this will become more and more advanced and become more than just using gets, where we'll have a sign-in experience here in the future. Right now, this is on just this page because we were just making sure that everything's stable in production. But in the next few days, you'll see that all these get queries now will return information based on the demo tent, the same as what you'd see if you were anonymously logged in inside of Graph Explorer here. All that data of going through the profile and seeing your photo is going to come through as Megan, this is what you will see in that try experience. So please, can you give that a whirl? Give us any feedback on Twitter, just using the Microsoft Graph hashtag. We would really appreciate it before we go live into production with everything else. So as our first topic, we have Paul Schaeflein, who, as I just mentioned, actually, with our podcast that we do weekly, Paul is my co-host and avid audio editor that we share the work of at the moment. Paul has been working on this internally with a bunch of other people, and we really wanted to get you guys aware of what's going on in terms of this thought process around extending the Graph SDK on top of all the work that we do and Daryl drives internally in Microsoft. So, Paul, do you want to take over and introduce yourself and share your screen?
Certainly. So hello, everyone. As Jeremy mentioned, my name is Paul. I'm a developer from Chicago area, and I'm happy to share some of this work that I've done. And this is partially a call for others to join in. The goal here, as we mentioned, it's a community library. So we have a repo under the Microsoft Graph organization, which is community contributed extensions to the graph. And so if you scroll down here, there's a quick little sample, but we do have a roadmap page. And the idea here is that perhaps we want to get information from either Microsoft Graph or other Microsoft services or any API really that we want to use the same paradigm that the SDK is using, right? And so we have an initial list of things that are done with some calls to action if you have some more information. But before I go too deep into this, I want to just go through a quick sample real quick and show you what we can do with this. So one example that we have is the site theming. So I'm going to go through and create a site real quick, and then I want to apply a theme to that using .NET Standard or a C#, .NET Core application. So I'm going to create a new site real quick here. And we'll let this build out here. And while we do that, I'm going to go to the sample code. So in the repo, we do have a samples folder. So I'm going to go back and show you that real quick. So if I scroll down into the repository, we have a samples folder, and there's a sample console app here which does 2 or 3 different things. I'm going to just show one of them at the moment. Like any application using Microsoft Graph, we do need to register an application in Azure Active Directory, and so we have a screenshot in here doing that. Notice that this particular example is set as a public client, so I don't need a client secret. And then we list the things that the samples do further on down. The one I'm going to show you today is a site design sample. And so part of the permission request that I've done here is I've gone into the Azure Active Directory and I said I want SharePoint permission. And then this particular example, since I'm setting a site design, I need to be able to do a sites.manage. So I granted that API permission, or I made that request in the Azure Active Directory. And obviously, if I'm using this for a single tenant experience, I can consent right there or do whatever your typical consent flow would normally be. So having set that up, I now have this application that will run through, and it will come through and do a site design. And so what I want to call out here is this, starting at line 20, this highlighted snippet of code here. If you've used the Microsoft Graph SDK for .NET, this will look familiar to you, where I have a graph service client, and then I have a fluid interface or fluid methods to go and make a request. But you'll notice here at line 22, the request object is the SharePoint API. Again, the idea here is that I have .NET code running on .NET Standard. The Microsoft SharePoint CSOM library is not yet at .NET Standard, so it's kind of a roadblock. Furthermore, I already have this infrastructure set up. I have the Graph Service Client working for other things in my application, so I want to just get something from SharePoint that's not yet migrated over to the Graph. If I was just doing list items or site information, I would use the Microsoft Graph requests for sites and lists. Those work just fine. But in this particular example, site designs or site scripts aren't there yet. And so this community library will then extend that with this builder to give me the SharePoint API, and I'm passing in my URL. And behind the scenes, we're going to build this to have the _API endpoint that you would expect. So let's just run this real quick. The idea here is that we're just going to apply a theme. And there's a couple other things I want to show you as part of what we've done here in this sample. So first of all, you'll notice, I have to stop this and make sure I get the right site here. Sorry. This is the site I created is called Graph Call Live Demo. So let's change that real quick. And now we'll run that. Let's make sure my site has finished provisioning. Okay, there it is. You'll notice I'm going to go into this real quick. And if we look at change the look, you'll notice that the theme is whatever was assigned to me by SharePoint, right? It's the grayish theme. So the goal here would be that we can apply a site design to change that. So now I'm going to go back in here and we'll look. We seem to be all set here. Let's run this further. And I hit the wrong button. My apologies, run this. What we're going to do here now is we're going to end up using, I want to go into this graph service client. And what we're doing in here is that using the device code provider that comes with the Graph SDK. So that lets me do an implicit flow, if you will, but I don't have a UI necessarily as part of my app. So we will let this run. Continue on here. We should pop up. Part of the device code is something's not working. What did I change? And F11. I don't need that. And because I forgot to do my await. It's even telling me that, look at that. All right, 4th time's the charm, right? We'll run this one more time. We'll come through, and I expect the console to tell me log in. There we go. So I'm going to go to the device login page. So I'm going to use the same browser session here. I'm going to go to device login. And this will require me to enter the code. Once I do that, I want to log in. I'll do that again. I'm logging in with my account from my Office 365 developer program tenant. It's all set. Once the sign-in works, eventually that will signal back to my application that it worked. I can then get a token and move on, and you can see here it finished. All right. And so let me press enter to continue. This window, I want to show you this in just a moment, but if we go back now to my site, go back to the demo, and if we look in here under site designs, we should see that it applied the graph call green theme for me, which is what I wanted it to do. And if I refresh this page, we should now see some green accents on here. There we go. So what did that really do? So behind the scenes, when I look at this method that we ran, it did the typical steps that I would expect to run. I then created a site script, and then that site design, which calls into that site script, and then I actually apply it. So you'll see there's these 3 calls of doing the graph service client .SharePoint API. Now, part of what we included in this sample is a logging that Daryl actually created a while back. I'm going to take this output here real quick, and we'll copy this over into a better editor. And if I look in here, you'll see what this logging provider is doing is it's showing you that as we ran through this, it did a post to the scdev.sharepoint.com at this site, and you'll notice there's the API that was put in there, and here is the request object. And further down, you can see the response. And so part of what this community library will give you is this logging HTTP provider that will simply dump out all the information. Obviously, we're removing the token so that we're not exposing any information, but I can see what calls are going back and forth. Yes, the Microsoft Graph Docs has that try it and the sample response, but sometimes it's helpful to see the data that's coming back in your particular instance. So we're dumping all that out as well. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, if we go into this creating the graph service client in here, you'll notice this is using the MSAL public client application builder. So this lets me set up my application however I need it to be. In this particular example, I'm using a specific tenant, so I'm setting that tenant ID and my client ID. And as you'll notice here, I use the device code provider. There are other providers for things you'd expect to see, like authorization code and client credentials, if you're using those. And then I just have a graph service client. And at this point, another thing I want to point out is when we were doing this, you'll notice this string right here is the scopes that I'm going to be sending to the graph service client, in which the graph service client will be sending to Azure Active Directory. The net effect of this is that any scope that I can use in a call to get a token from Microsoft Graph, I could pass in here. So I'm not limited to using SharePoint, and I'm not limited to using Microsoft Graph. I can put in the permissions or the scope identifier for my API that if I've written or any API that's out there. Again, building on these tools, if I've got code that, or I have an application that is interacting with Microsoft Graph, and I find Graph Service Client brings lots of goodies to the table for me, why should I reinvent the pieces for non-Microsoft Graph API. So that's the goal around that here. Now, this, of course, is an open source project. So you'll see here this the Graph.Community project. It's not very large here. We have some request models that we are talking. Again, we have SharePoint for now, and you've even extended a capability that's coming to Microsoft Graph that we'll want to pull out. But it's not very complicated. It's easy to get in here, and there's some examples and test code and documentation on how to get going on all that. So that's my 10-minute overview. I think that's how much time I was allotted, and I'm not sure if there's any questions that came up in the chat window. I'm happy to handle those, or go into more detail if someone has something else they'd like to see.
That's awesome, Paul. Thank you. So just as an aside there, like what drove you to do this? Was this something that you were seeing in your own projects that helped?
Yeah, yes. So the primary driver was just this case of setting applying a site design using managed code or using a .NET standard code, right? And so there's a couple of areas where that's helpful. For example, Azure Functions v2 can run .NET standard code. And as well, again, that was the primary driver was, well, we needed to apply a site design, and I didn't necessarily want to build up a whole HTTP infrastructure to do the REST calls that are part of that. And then the other bit is, as a sanity check, right, there's a whole section here in the change log. So years and years and years ago, I wrote a blog post on how to access the change log using CSOM and REST inside of SharePoint. And I took that code and primarily ported it over lock, stock, and barrel here to do this call, just replacing the web calls here. So it really is a way to say, well, I've got code that's running somewhere else, and I want to modernize that code. I don't have to change everything. I can really just switch out the call to CSOM or my REST calls. Instead of migrating them to use Azure Active Directory authentication, I can just roll them into the Microsoft Graph tools.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so there's a few people in the chat that sound like they're going to go away and have a look at that. And I'd really encourage you to work with Paul. So the link to that GitHub, Paul can share in the chat once we hand back over. So if there are no questions, we'll move on, because I know Vincent, I've kind of crushed a hour presentation into 30 minutes for him. So Paul, I appreciate you staying on time.
So yeah, and last thing I'll say is, folks, if you're interested, open up an issue in this GitHub repo. We want to make sure we don't have people duplicating the work, and I'm happy to help guide people along. So yeah, and I'll put the link in the chat, certainly.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Okay, so next up, we have Vincent Biret, who has been working on a bunch of stuff around the Microsoft Graph, and we were chatting at the last SharePoint Seattle SharePoint Fest event a few weeks ago now, and he was explaining they've been doing some great work around Azure Durable Functions and Graph, and I was like, it'd be great to get you on the call, much like conversations obviously I have with Paul every week, to showcase to the community what he's been doing here. So Vincent, thanks so much for joining the call and sharing all this work that you've been doing around functions and Graph. And again, if you want to just take over the mic and share the screen, and we can get going.
All right, so yeah, thank you very much for having me on the call. Today I'm going to be demonstrating on how you can build your provisioning tool or infrastructure for your digital workplace, leveraging Azure Durable Functions and the Microsoft Graph, of course. So before I begin, I'm Vincent Biret. Nice to meet you, everyone. I'm an Office Dev MVP based out of Montreal, Canada. And I work as an Azure and Office 365 developer at 22lead, which is a Canadian-based consulting company. If you want to reach out to me, you can connect on Twitter. Here's my blog, and I'm also on other social media. So before we begin, I'd like to set a bit of context to understand what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve that. If we look at the Microsoft 365 ecosystem over the past few years, we can see that it kind of became more complex over time, right? If you think about the digital workplace back in 2012, most of the users were barely using SharePoint to store their files and to do some co-authoring, Outlook to do some messaging, and OneNote to take some notes. And some of them had a project as well to track their project and their progress, right? And over time, Microsoft acquired companies or built new tools to do some internal communications, external communications, team work, automation, helping with your tasks and organizing your teams, building new apps, and so on and so forth, as well as building forms, right? So if you look now today at the collaboration and digital workplace ecosystem, you can see that it became much more complex, and it has many more tools that are available today for the end users. Again, another thing we need to look at is the different boundaries, right? In your organization, you have different boundaries. The internal boundary, which would be your team, your division, the people whom you work with on a day-to-day basis. And then you have the external boundary, which is your contractors, your partners, other companies that you know and talk to on a weekly or monthly basis. And then you have a public boundary, depending on what kind of business you're doing, which could be consumers, they could be public customers that you don't necessarily know of or identify clearly, but you always interact with them somehow on a yearly basis. And those tools map to those different boundaries. So I laid out some tools in those boundaries. Keep in mind, this is an example. Some companies might be using different tools in different boundaries in different scenarios, but you have to keep that in mind when you want to provision different tools or make things available for your end users, depending on the scenarios and who they will be interacting with. What are the effects of having more specialized tools? So first, you have more efficient tools because they are specialized and dedicated to one task. They do that task better, and they provide better capabilities for that set of tasks or that set of scenarios, right? You also get faster releases because at Microsoft you get dedicated product teams that work on a subset of scenarios and subset of features for one specific product or service. They're able to be independent from any platform, and they can ship faster releases, and you get, of course, better releases more often, and so on and so forth. On the you have context switching because you have lots of different tools. Well, users to achieve a set of tasks or on their day-to-day need to switch between Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, Outlook again, Teams again, and so on and so forth. And that can induce friction and loss of times and also focus from the user. Because we have more tools, which means we have more licenses, and licensing can be complex. So it also adds some burden on the IT services to acquire, provision, and decommission those licenses. And we might see multiple APIs also being made available, which makes things more complex for developers. And lastly, all the administrative life cycles, from provisioning the digital workplace to making sure governance is in place, to make sure we have proper security, to make sure that it's being archived or decommissioned when it's not used anymore. All of that gets multiplied by the numbers of tools, right? So if we try to address those different drawbacks, well, the first rule of licensing is you don't talk about licensing. The easiest way to get an answer about licensing is to contact Microsoft directly or specialized partners. So we will not talk about that today. And if you talk about context switching, well, we're having this call on Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft Teams is this great tool that allows you to build some digital workplace for at least the teams in our organization and bring at one place everything from the files to the conversations to different tools using the tabs and pinning those different tools as tabs in the team, right within the team with the context of what you're doing and so on and so forth. So that already addresses that kind of issue of context switching, right? You can put everything at one place right within the context, and users can leverage that instead of having many different windows open and switching between those different windows. If we talk about multiple APIs, well, we are on the Microsoft Graph community call. Microsoft has been investing a lot over the last few years to provide one single API that provides a consistent way to talk to it and write the request and handle the authentication and authorization and all those kind of things, right? So it makes a lot of things easier for the end and for the developers. And lastly, we're left with administrative lifecycle tasks, things like, again, dealing with provisioning, handling security, handling governance, handling archiving and decommissioning the different environments and the different things your users might need to achieve what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And this is what we'll be focusing on today. So what things do we need to automate, or do we want to automate? Well, many things, actually. Things like creating an Office 365 group, automating, enabling teams on the group, updating the logos, setting the security, creating channels, creating creating notebooks and adding templated notes on the notebooks, creating a plan and a planner plan for the project, and so on and so forth, right? I'm going to be showing you one solution, one way to implement it. But again, keep in mind that this is not the solution. You have different avenues and different ways you can implement your digital workplace provisioning solution. And before I dive into the technical details and the solution I built, I would like to just recap on the different options you have here. The first thing you will want to do when you are building a true self-service provisioning solution for your digital workplace is, well, the UI, right? At some point, you need some way to ask the end user what do they want, and based on the data they provided you, then kick off and start some automation process or some provisioning process at least, right? So the more on this graph, the more we'll go to the right, the more we'll have a complex tool, which will require more time to implement something and more technical knowledge. But the more we go up on this graph, the more we'll have control also. And so the more we'll be able to have solutions that are very detailed and tailored to our specific needs. And the first one I want to put on this graph is Microsoft Forms. Again, Microsoft Forms comes from the education industry, and it's a way to build very simple forms to ask for data from the user and then submit that data somewhere. And based on that data, you can then trigger some automation or some cycle, or at least fill the database and then act on that, right? It's very simple. It's just a matter of adding the different fields and then providing the forms to the different users so they can start working on that. The next one, a bit more complex, is from the Power Platform. It's Power Apps. It allows you to build different apps, a bit more complex, with different screens, with complex validation, with different data sources, and so on and so forth. So again, it's another way to build a UI for your end users. The next one, which is more on the developer spectrum of skill sets, is custom Microsoft Teams tabs or SharePoint Framework web parts. So again, SharePoint Framework comes with an extensibility model. Teams as well, they are kind of converging at some point, and they allow you to build web parts that you can drop on SharePoint pages, or team tabs that you can use in Microsoft Teams. And that handles a lot of things for you, like hosting, security handling, and as well as being discoverable because users are already using Microsoft Teams and or SharePoint in their organization. So that's also a sweet spot to leverage. The next thing you can also leverage is bots. You can perfectly build a bot to start your provisioning sequence and provide kind of a user interface, or at least a user experience to your end users, and drive them through conversation to giving you all the details. So, hey, I'm a user. I want to start a new project. All right, what kind of project it is, for what customer, and so on and so forth. Right, and through conversations, you can leverage bots to again gather the data and then start via automation process. And lastly, you can, of course, go fully custom and develop whatever application you want to develop. When you look at all those solutions and all those options, I would always encourage you to start from the bottom left corner and see if that solution meets your requirements or not. And if it doesn't, go on the upper right corner, because you will save a lot of time, and it's gonna make a lot of things easier for you. In my case, I use Microsoft SharePoint Framework web part, custom web part to gather the data, because I'm a developer and because I have development knowledge. But again, you're not forced to use that. You can use any of the solutions on this diagram. Then once you have built some kind of UI, you need to ask those same kind of questions again for automation. And the easiest way to automate things in Office 365 is Microsoft Flow. It's kind of this end user driven way to automate things in Microsoft 365, and that allows you to build different workflows that can talk to different services, right? And the good thing about Microsoft Flow, it's that on the technical standpoint, it's built on the same foundation as Logic Apps, which is more on the dev spectrum of things, and which allows developers leveraging Azure to build workflows and connect to different data sources. The good thing and an advice I always give to our customers or in the community is that you can always start with a flow, prototype something, and see if it works and see if you get traction and adoption in the company. And then once you reach limitations in terms of performance, executions, licensing, whatever it is, right? You can always export a flow as a logic app, so IT can take over, can help and augment or implement or deploy the logic app instead. So you can always transition from a flow to a logic app, and it's a good way actually to start things up, and then when you reach some limitation, move to something that has more capabilities. Another way to implement some automation in Office 365 is to leverage Azure Functions. Those are the serverless service provided by Microsoft. They allow you to focus only on the line of business code. They're great, they're fast, and they're cheap, and we'll see more about that just later. And all that is built on the same foundation as Azure Web Apps and Azure Web Jobs that allow you to develop Web API or websites, as well as backend running agents or services, right? If we look a bit more from the IT pros perspective, if we think about PowerShell and automation in that way, well, you also have Azure automation runbooks that you can leverage to write PowerShell and run that in the cloud without needing to maintain a machine or anything like that. So it's also a great way to do automation from an IT pros perspective again. The only drawback is the web integration, so integrating it to as an API to any kind of application is going to be a bit harder than other solutions listed before. And of course, you can always go custom, but again, that's going to be costing a lot of investment and handling cross-cutting concerns. The great thing about Logic App, Functions, Web Apps, and Web Jobs is they are built and based on the same thing, which is app service environment, which has been in Azure for the past, I want to say, 7 years at least. And that app service environment provides cross-cutting concern capabilities like handling cross-origin resource sharing requests, handling authentication and authorization, auto-scaling, and all those kind of things, right? So it's fairly easy to go from the bottom left corner and upscale it to the upper right corner within that red square if you need to. And again, you will have a lot of things that you can reuse or work the same within those 4 solutions. So again, start from the bottom left corner if you must, and then go on the right side depending on your requirements and what you're trying to achieve. So in my case, I built my solution leveraging 3 things actually: a Schaeflein framework web part for the UI aspect, an Azure durable function for the automation aspect, and of course, all of that talks to the Microsoft Graph on the backend to execute all the changes that are required in Office 365. And with that, I think it's enough slides, and you guys want to see demos. So I'm going to move that away. So here's my form. So imagine we're consulting. I'm going to just refresh the page, but imagine you're a consultant. Imagine you're a consulting company. You can be a consulting company doing IT stuff, but you can also be another kind of consulting company for, I don't know, construction or engineering and so on and so forth, right? And every time you engage with a customer, well, you give that customer a code that you use internally, and you want to do things like allowing them to access their, I don't know, their invoices, any kind of documentation you want to share with them, allow them to copy an email so you can store all the communications and review them if you need to, and so on and so forth. That's from the external point of view. And from the internal point of view, you want to do things like having a Microsoft Teams so your employees can chat about whatever is going on for the project and have different channels for different projects, as well as planner plans, OneNotes, and so on and so forth, right? So this is what we're trying to achieve, making sure that every time we have a new customer that starts a new project in our organization, it's not a hassle to go in the Office 365 administration portal, to go create a team, then go create an Office 365 group, then create a bunch of SharePoint websites, then create custom lists, and so on and so forth. We want just one click if you want to set it all up for us, and that will save a lot of time not only to IT but also to end users, because they will not be waiting after IT. They will have self-service capabilities and so on and so forth, right? So here's the form that I built using SharePoint framework solution and a custom web part. So again, as we are onboarding this new customer, which is the Microsoft Graph community call, we will need to give it a new code and also give a name to the email address that they will be able to copy whenever they are communicating with us. So we archive all the different communications. And then we can fill our details. I hope my keyboard is not too noisy. Then for the logo, I'll set just a picture of me so I don't have any copyright issues. And then for each and every project, what we do is we usually give customer code, a free numbers project code, sorry. So this way we can quickly identify between one project and another one. Then the title of the project will be initial wireframes setup. For example, you can put some description and then quickly make sure that you have a proper people invited to the team with the different roles that they might have. And that's about it, actually. You can see that in a few minutes, I can fill out all the details that I need for my new customer and for my new project that's about to start. I have everything described here, and then I can submit that to have that created. What this is going to do, it's going to talk to an Azure function behind the scenes that's running here. I'll detail that later, and start talking to a graph to provision the different things, including the Microsoft team here, sending invitation emails, and all those different things. So before we dive into the code, I want to lay some basic principles about Azure durable functions, because I think those are pretty new to most of the people, and then we'll dive into the code. So if we step back a little bit and we think about Azure Functions, and I assume here that most of you are familiar with Azure Functions. What are the pros and cons of Azure Functions? Well, first, they are cheap to build, to run, and to execute. They are super fast as well, so we have performance out of the box, and they're simple to implement, because the body of what you need to write in terms of code is just the body of the function. You don't need to care more about setting up some kind of dependency injection or other more complex things that you get, for example, with the ASP.NET Core. And lastly, they scale extensively. So whether you need to handle 100 requests per second or 100,000 requests per second, it's pretty much the same code you'll be writing at the end of the day with an Azure function. The cons are, in order to achieve that scalability, they are stateless. So Azure Functions by default cannot maintain a state. And if you try to do that, you'll run into issues. And that kind of makes things a bit more complex when you're writing code and trying to translate business requirements into code, right? Coordination is a nightmare usually when you have different functions that need to talk to each other, and they come with a 10 to 15 minutes limit runtime. So if anything you're trying to do needs to run more than that or longer than that, well, you're kind of stuck on this, right? If we deep dive a little bit more under the coordinating aspect of Azure Functions, well, let's assume you have one first function that creates an Office 365 group, right? And then you have a second function that, for example, enables Microsoft Teams on that Office 365 group. And of course, you need that second function to only start whenever the first one is finished. So one of the common patterns was to leverage some kind of queue, either the service bus, the storage, or something else, and then to make sure they're plugged to one another. And the first function would send the message. The second one would start when the message will be received, and so on and so forth. And that's pretty easy when you only have two functions. The trouble comes when you want to do other things like setting the logo and then setting permissions and then creating a tab and so on and so forth. And you need to create more and more queues and plug them all together. And that becomes super complex when you have an issue and you need to understand at what part the whole process failed. Is it a queuing issue? Is it a function issue? Which one did fail? And so on and so forth, right? The other common pattern we would see with Azure Function is the state repository. So we still have our set of different Azure functions, but in that case, we have some kind of state repository, usually some kind of database or the storage table services. And what would happen is the API would set some data in the state repository, and then each and every function would continuously poll for data that's in the current state that that function is interested in, do the processing, update the data, and so on and so forth for each and every function. But again, all those different patterns felt a bit like that, right? When you needed to debug and understand what went wrong and where is the issue coming from, well, you have this kind of spaghetti mess that is impossible to debug at the end of the day. So this is why the Azure Function teams introduced Azure Durable Functions over time. So at their core, they are regular Azure functions. So you get all the benefits that you would get out of a regular Azure function. But on top of that, they are a code-defined workflow. They allow you to define some kind of logic and to abstract the logic from the technical implementation. It also automates states management for you. So you get a state for free and you don't need to care about it much. It also reports the status, so you are able to query via an automatically generated API for you. Where is your workflow at for which specific instance, and what is it doing, and so on and so forth. And that also enables more complex design patterns like fan in, fan out, chaining, monitoring, and so on and so forth. So if we look at the anatomy of a regular Azure function, usually you have some kind of trigger, HTTP call, request, or some kind of message, and then that would start the function would be doing thing, and that's it, right? But in that case, if we want to convert that to an Azure Durable Function, what we will have to do is, well, first pull in the Azure Durable Functions SDK, of course, but then make that specific function an orchestration client. So this particular function will be in charge of saying, hey, I have some work, start a new workflow instance for that specific request, and it will create a new instance, right? And it will do so by talking to something called an orchestrator. And that guy will be in charge of, as the name would say, orchestrating the different things you want to do, making sure that you have control logic and all those kind of things. And those different things you want to do will be implemented in other functions that are called activities. So the first one will be, again, creating the Office 365 group. The second one, enabling Microsoft Teams. The third one, setting up the logo, and so on and so forth. And the orchestrator will be only in charge of calling the different activities, and the activities doing whatever they are doing. But this way, you have kind of this nice separation of boundaries between the flow control or the logic or the workflow on one side in the orchestrator, and the technical implementation of each and every task or activity, if you want, within the activities. And lastly, well, as I mentioned, you have some kind of state that you can carry and pass along, and that's persisted in Azure Blob Storage for you automatically. You don't need to care about that very much. A few things that if you run into Azure Durable Functions, you want to keep in mind. The orchestrator will run multiple times, and this is because the orchestration SDK does some black magic. It's okay, but keep that in mind. Orchestrator is only supposed to coordinate activities, so don't do anything random, like generating GUIDs, generating random numbers, or anything like that, because from one step to another, you'll get two different values. Don't do any time comparison, because again, the orchestrator will be put to sleep sometimes, and you'll get different times that you're not expecting. Don't do any async call, like SQL call or calling HTTP request or anything like that. And make sure every time you call the orchestrator with the same state and the same input output, well, it will always do the same thing. You don't have any kind of logic that depends on other random factors. And lastly, make sure you use the orchestrator provided methods to call the different activities. Lastly, if you want to leverage the state, well, it's important that your state is serializable, and this way the SDK can serialize it and put it in the storage for you and provide it to you. And with that, now that we have the concepts in mind, let's dive into the code. So the way this works here is that if I look at my project here, I do have my team creation, and it's a regular Azure function. And I'm going to zoom in for you so it's easier to see, move that away. And yeah, again, I have this regular function, which is my activity which runs on an HTTP request here, thanks to the HTTP trigger on a post request. This is the same request my SharePoint Framework web part is sending with all the data I gathered from the form. And based on that, it will just use the durable orchestration client to say, all right, client, I want to start a new instance here with this specific orchestrator and that specific payload. Again, it's the same payload that I got from the request earlier here. Then if we zoom into the orchestrator itself, well, you'll see that even my code can look pretty compact. It does very, very simple things. The first thing it does is creating the Office 365 group, or at least checking that it's already here for me. And that's implemented in one activity. So it calls the first activity here. It also reports the status saying I'm at step 1 out of 10 or 1 out of something else, right? So this way I can query it with the state API. Then the second thing it does, it sets the logo, it stores the logo in the storage so I can pick it up later, and then it sets the logo using the Microsoft Graph API. Another interesting thing is setting the logo sometimes fails for some reasons. That's okay. In the orchestration API provides me with methods that allow me to retry automatically. So this way I don't have to write any retry logic. It's already handled for me because my function has failed or my activity has failed. So automatically the orchestrator will try to retry. Well, we'll retry it. And the way you do that is you specify a specific pattern. Here I have back off coefficient of 2. I start backing off every 30 seconds and then 1 minute and then 2 minutes and so on and so forth until I've retried 5 times. And again, all of that is handled automatically for me. Then I do things like enabling teams and then getting the different channel IDs and then creating the project plan in Planner, creating the OneNote, adding a welcome message for the end users and so on and so forth. All of that automatically for me. If we dive into the specific activity, here I'm using the plain Microsoft Graph SDK, the .NET SDK that's provided by Microsoft. And again, here I have the access token. That's part of my context that I traded for the proper access token. And I'm using the Graph Service client. And once I have a client, well, I can do, all right, is there already a group that already has that email alias? If yes, just give me the ID. If not, well, I'll create one. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm saying, hey, client.groups.request.add async, and I'm adding the group with those specific properties and so on and so forth. Once I've created the group, I'm adding all the different members and owners automatically to the group. And that's all I'm doing, because again, I want to make sure that I have very simple functions or activities that are easy to debug, that do 1 or maybe 2 things at most. And this way it's easier to test, it's easier to isolate it, and it's easier to orchestrate, more importantly. So now if we go to another activity, same principle. I do get the Graph client here, and then I get my logo from the storage, the blob storage. I put it in earlier. And then what I do is I just use the Graph SDK again here to set up the icon or the logo, if you want. And all the activities pretty much do the same thing for OneNote, for Planner, for adding a welcome message in Teams, and all those different things that I'm doing. If we look at the results before I move to the questions, and if I can find the proper window, we should see now a new team, which is called Microsoft Graph.Community call. You can see it has my picture, which is the logo in that case. And then you can see that it has a general channel here with a planner plan, with a planner tab, with a planner plan inside the tab. That's going to load after some point. It already has some planner tasks, like the first things we need to do to initiate the team and do other things, manual things like, I don't know, like scheduling the kickoff call or doing other things like that, which we could, by the way, automate with Microsoft Graph as well. You can see in the conversations that it has a welcome message with mentions, so people know that something, from their point of view, they'll get a notification here saying, hey, you got added to a Microsoft team. Here's a welcome message. So, you know, it draws their attention and they go look it up. So this way, the users that provision that don't need to set yet another message saying, hey, there's something here and so on and so forth. It's natural for them. They already have something that draws their attention, and then all the context and all the content are right at hand, and they can start working and providing value and creating stuff, right? For a project, same thing. We created a dedicated channel for the project, put a welcome message, did things like added the OneNote with different templates, adding the planner with different tasks, and so on and so forth here. And with that, I know we're running out of time, so I'll say quickly thank you here. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Twitter or via my blog, and I'll handle the questions and hand it back to Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. So you've said the slides are shared. Do you have any of that on GitHub with the code samples and so forth that you can share in the chat?
The code is not yet on GitHub. I'll work on that. The slides, this is a squeezed down version of the 1 hour session, as you know. So I'll update that version. If you want to know more details, I already have on SlideShare the 1 hour version of that session that has more details about different aspects. But yes, I'll upload that deck as well on SlideShare and provide the link in the chat.
That's awesome. Thanks, Vincent. So for those that want to follow along and behind the scenes, I'll chase about the GitHub when they're ready. If you want to follow Vincent on his @Biret on Twitter, that's probably the best place to keep in touch with as we get updates on this content. But I really appreciate you sharing that on Durable Functions. And I know you've been doing some work with us around a PR to try and make the bindings a bit better on the current Azure Functions bindings with the Microsoft Graph. We are looking for more feedback on those bindings too. And so if you are using Azure Functions, if you could please reach out to me at jthake on Twitter. I'll give you a follow and we can have a quick DM conversation around this because I'd love to get that feedback around how people are using functions with the graph and what you'd like to see. There are improvements the Azure Functions team are doing to improve bindings, for instance, on token acquisition to make that slightly easier based on feedback from everybody. But if there are other things, I'd really like to hear from you. So again, thanks for sharing this today with the Durable Functions, Vincent. That's awesome. Just as a quick reminder, I'm just sharing my screen. The next monthly call will be October 1st. We are still looking for contributions for this call. So if you are doing anything really exciting with the graph and you'd like to share that with the community, this is a great forum stage for you guys to put together a presentation and share your code. So please do that if you haven't. Again, a big thank you to Paul and Vincent this week for contributing, and please keep the conversation going on Twitter with the hashtag Microsoft Graph, and follow all the folks that you've seen today on the call because, as I say, they are sharing a lot of cool information there. And so with that, with 3 minutes left, just one little last thing. Essentially, if you do have questions, technical questions, we are running in pilot right now a new dashboard to monitor questions that come through Stack Overflow using the Microsoft Graph tag. And so we are aware that we haven't been as responsive as people would expect in answering questions. And so we're trying to get better there. And so I'd love to hear if you feel like that experience is getting better for you in terms of response times on the Stack Overflow side of the house. So please, if you have questions, we do monitor those, and we are growing a team of people that will be looking at those questions and be able to help, within a 24-hour time frame on those questions that get asked on Stack Overflow. So a big thank you today. This recording will go live and be available on the Graph blog. If you go to graph.microsoft.com and hit the resources at the top and launch the blog. And thank you again, and we'll see you next month, as I just mentioned, at October 1st at 8 a.m. PDT. So enjoy the rest of your month, and we'll see you soon.